Welcome. My name is James Branum, and I'm a minister with the Objector.Church, a religious, humanist, peace-oriented community, and I want to welcome you to this week's edition of our webcast. We do these every week, more or less, and you can find them always at our website, Objector.Church, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Objector.Church. Each one of these weekly webcasts is a chance for inspiration, information, and interaction. The interactive part comes by way of our Facebook page. So if you have comments, questions, please make them there. Would love to engage with you. But you're also always welcome to email me at james@objector.church. For this week's webcast, we have two things. The first one is something I've adapted from a radio program I put together a couple of years ago, but I've added a visual component to it since this is a video webcast. And it's discussing the historical event of the Oklahoma Green Corn Rebellion, a very interesting movement in southeastern Oklahoma that happened in August 1917, 102 years ago as of this year. And this was a triracial, poor people's movement of poor white, black, and American Indian folks who decided to start a revolution from a bit of a socialist or anarchist perspective. And what it was really about was the draft. They had no desire to fight in a rich man's war. They had enough of that. And so they took some pretty gutsy moves. And in this episode, we'll mostly just be telling the story. Hopefully, they'll have the time to work on it. Next week, we'll be picking this up, if not the week after. And we'll be looking at this in more detail, some of the social long-term historical implications of what happened with the Green Corn Rebellion. I will mention, though, as a community with the Objector.Church, we're a peace community, so it may seem ironic us talking about a movement that at least in part had a violent element to it. But I'm going to talk about, and we'll discuss this more in the follow-up to this episode, but I think it's important to note that this revolution was focused on the fact they did not want to fight an overseas war. They did not want to fight in a European war that was fought for the rich. And they saw it being morally acceptable to fight for their own preservation, their own community's survival. And as we'll talk about in that follow-up episode, what's really striking was that in many ways they were willing to fire until they saw the posses composed of their neighbors. And for many of them, they couldn't pull the trigger on their neighbors. So anyway, there's a lot of nuance, complexity to this issue, saying it from the get-go, but I also think it's a really important history to tell. By the way, I'll mention that for many of us here in Oklahoma, it's a very inspirational thing, this resistance. And so back with the 100th anniversary, we did create a special website to commemorate this and to continue the conversation. So if you want to look at that, the website for that is greencorn.org. Anyway, though, that will be our upcoming segment right after this. However, I should mention the final part of our program tonight will be another episode of Wonder in Poetry from Serena Blaiz. She'll be reading a poet, this one, an Oklahoma poet. By the way, for anyone who's offended by bad words, there will be a few bad words in that poem. So, anyway. But I just want to give you the heads up on that. Anyway, though, last of all, before we plunge into the programming, I do want to mention that the radio program that I've adapted this from was 2 years ago. I was talking about the centennial of the Green Corn Rebellion. Obviously, that was 2 years ago. And finally, I want to mention that if you would like to support our work, our ability to keep doing these webcasts and all the other work that we are doing, including through the organizations we sponsor, which includes Courage to Resist, a national organization committed to supporting GI resistors, conscience objectors, and others who are blowing the whistle on the abuses of our current imperial government. That's some of the work that we are supporting. We also have work here in Oklahoma through Just Future and the Center for Conscience and Action. In fact, that Green Corn website I mentioned a moment ago, greencorn.org, that's one of the projects that our local group here in Oklahoma continues to support. So anyway, if you like what we're about, you want to join our community or just support us a little bit financially, all the information about that is on our website at Objector.Church. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to the BSR Oklahoma Magazine Show with James Branum. This is BSR episode number 203, first broadcast on August 4th, 2017, on Community Talk Radio KTLR 890 AM and 103.7 FM in Oklahoma City, and online as always at broadspectrumradio.com. In this episode, we will be airing part one of a series of special programs that commemorate the centennial of one of the most important events of Oklahoma history, the Green Corn Rebellion. These episodes will be a bit of a drama, told over a series of acts, sort of like a play. And I should also add, by its length, this will be, of course, a greatly abbreviated version of the events in question. We'll be talking about, of course, what did happen before, what led up to the rebellion itself, and then the influence of the rebellion up to the present day, and what lessons we might learn from it. Act 1. The early years of Oklahoma statehood were hard for a lot of people, American Indians most of all, who had not only lost the majority of their land through the Dawes allotment process in previous years, but were now seeing their land taken away from their only remaining land taken from them by every trick in the book, most often by wealthy folks who had themselves appointed as guardians of Indian orphan children. There were some who fought on the behalf of those who were being dispossessed, most notably Kate Bernard, the State Commissioner of Corrections and Charities, but most of the political elite of this state let it happen, and so more and more land was being taken. But poor black folks and white folks, they had it hard too in a different set of ways. What had happened previously? Poor folks from across the United States came to homestead land, which had, let's be frank, been taken by the U.S. federal government through the allotment process. And so you had an immediate, near 100% land ownership by the people that were farming or working the land. The problem was that within one generation, the majority of those homesteaders no longer owned their own land. The reasons for this are complex, but in short, the banks, politicians, and corporations had created an economic system that made it impossible for the majority of small-scale farm families to make it on their own, despite the stated intentions of the Homesteading Act. And so more and more people were plunging deeper and deeper into poverty and looking for relief. At first, through cooperative action to change the way that agricultural commodities were sold, but later through the ballot box, through the growing Oklahoma Socialist Party. As discussed in Jim Bissett's book, Agrarian Socialism in America, Marx, Jefferson, and Jesus in the Oklahoma Countryside, Oklahoma Socialists weren't always following the dictates of National Party officials, but instead sought to craft a sophisticated synthesis of three political traditions: the Marxist perspective on the working class and its struggles, the Jeffersonian perspective on an educated and independent citizenry, and the Christian tradition of sharing and cooperation. These concepts and the voices behind them were at times in tension, but nonetheless there was appearing to be a new birth of something new in Oklahoma, which was now becoming the strongest state socialist party and movement in the entire United States. But in the midst of this political process of understanding, of collectively working through these issues, there was a fight that was on. First, it was when these socialists took the mostly solitary stand of fighting against Jim Crow election laws, a fight where the Republicans and Democrats both did their best to keep black people from voting. And then came an even bigger challenge: a world war. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who had only recently been sworn into a second term of office after running behind the slogan, quote, "He kept us out of the war," asked Congress to declare war against the German Empire on April 6, 1917. And Congress readily agreed by a vote of 373 to 50 in the U.S. House and 82 to 6 in the U.S. Senate. At the same time, in April 1917, same month, the Socialist Party of America had a vote of its own in which it declared its, quote, "unalterable opposition," unquote, to the war, and urged that workers around the world should, quote, "refuse support to the governments in their wars," unquote. But even stronger sentiments had been previously made by Oklahoma Socialists at their state convention back in December of 1914, when a resolution stated, "Resolved that if war is declared, the Socialists of Oklahoma shall refuse to enlist, But if forced to enter the military service to murder fellow workers, we shall choose to die, fighting the enemies of humanity within our own ranks, rather than to perish fighting our fellow workers. We further pledge ourselves to use our influence to the end that all toilers shall refuse to work for the master class during such a war." Unquote. And so, a conflict was inevitable. And initially, it wasn't clear which side of this debate the American people were going to be on, since recruitment numbers were relatively low. Of course, Uncle Sam had an answer to that problem, because on May 18, 1917, a draft law was enacted, calling for all young men nationwide to register on a single day, June 5, 1917. While there were some sparks of conflict at registration centers around the country in some locales, the process went by in a mostly peaceful and orderly fashion. But Oklahoma's cooperativeness with the draft was on the low side, with almost half of men required to register actually failing to show up and register. And of those who did register, 72% sought to be excluded from being called up. Nonetheless, on July 20th of 1917, a blindfolded Newton D. Baker, Secretary of War under President Wilson, drew the numbers of those who would be called to sacrifice themselves to the American war machine, which set the gears in motion for the Green Corn Rebellion. Before we go on to the next act, I want to play a song now by David Rovix.
The story in parts usually depends on when it starts. When it first became a state, a grand convention, a great debate, but in the end, understand, speculators own the land. To maximize the landlord's greed, they'd only sell cotton seeds, so the tenant farmers, as a mass, formed the union of the working class. The flags were red, and the corn was green. Oklahoma, 1917. Black and white, understood their cause was right. Young and old, women and men, organized for a time when there'd be no landlords, there'd be no rent. They knew precisely what that meant. They knew that words would not suffice, for robber barons don't play nice. Tens of thousands among their ranks, as they rode at night by the river banks. The flags were red, and the corn was green. Oklahoma, 1917. Exploitation, the Gilded Age of revolution, from Prairie Creek to Mexico, to the fields where the cotton grows. When conscription came, they said no more shall poor men fight a rich man's war. They blew up bridges, cut the wires, they agitated and conspired. Sometimes rebels take the reins, other ones end up in chains. The flags were red and the corn was green. Oklahoma, 1917.
Act 3. An Okie Response to a World War. During the summer of 1917, the war and the draft was on everyone's minds in Oklahoma. The authorities were worried that this new state, less than 10 years old, might not be seen as sufficiently loyal to the nation. But for most folks, especially the poor, their worries are much more personal than an abstract pride in one state. Life was hard at this time in Oklahoma, and it wasn't an exaggeration to say that for many Okies, the Depression started several decades before the 1930s, and that poverty was a big part of their way of seeing the world. Many of those opposed to the war simply didn't want to die in a far-off land for a cause they didn't believe in. But many also had fears of what would happen in their absence to their wives, their kids, their own ma and pa, and what tragedy would befall on their loved ones if they were mown down in a trench in France. The reality was that life in this era in Oklahoma was often a life and death struggle. Every hand was needed to make ends meet in rural Oklahoma, so the idea of losing family patriarchs and adult sons to the draft was the last straw. Something had to be done. But it was unclear what the best response would be. Some who were opposed to the war and the draft, such as the Socialist Party, took the approach of seeking change through lobbying, politicking, and persuasion. but others said that words weren't enough, and that more active resistance was what was needed. Lots of meetings were held that summer. Secret meetings in rural locations. The groups that met went by many names. The Jones family, the Working Class Union, and sometimes no names at all. But in all these meetings, the fears of war were voiced, but also the dreams of a different world, in which poor people no longer had to die for the cause of the capitalist class. We only have snippets of these conversations in the historical record, often recounted in later trials of the Green Corn rebels, often by the way of testimony which was coerced as a way to avoid decades of prison time. But what we can piece together through these snippets is that these poor folks, a mix of white and black tenant farmers and Seminole and Muskogee Creek Indians, were at their wits' end. And so, plans began to be hatched. The exact details lost to history, but some only planned to hide draft-age men in the woods and hills of the area, but others were talking openly of revolution and a march to Washington, D.C. The first shots of the rebellion were fired on August 2, 1917, when a group of black farmers and members of the Working Class Union engaged Seminole County Sheriff Frank Grawl and his deputy in a gun battle. From there, it was on. I'm now going to read a few paragraphs from page 151 of Jim Bessett's Agrarian Socialism in America, Marx, Jefferson, and Jesus in the Oklahoma Countryside, 1904 to 1920. As Bessett gives a good picture, good little summation of what happened next. Their plan was to cripple the ability of officials to enforce the draft by burning bridges, cutting telephone and telegraph wires, and destroying oil pipelines. Then they would begin a march to Washington, joining forces along the way with other workers and farmers sympathetic to their cause. By the time they reached the capital, they predicted their numbers would be so great that President Wilson would be forced to abandon the war effort. On their march, the militants intended to survive by eating corn picked from the fields every evening, thus giving the rebellion its name. Local authorities reacted quickly and decisively to the Green Corn Rebellion, and the rebels' planned march to Washington never materialized. Hastily formed posses routed members of the WCU wherever they congregated, crushing the abortive rebellion within a week. Disturbed by what they perceived as an evidence of a well-organized and dangerous threat, officials began making wholesale arrests in the wake of the uprising. In one location in Seminole County, investigators discovered a cache containing 75 sticks of dynamite, 8 ounces of strychnine, and 1 Winchester rifle. Officials issued blank indictments against participants in the rebellion for draft resistance, and leaders were indicted under the more serious charge of, quote, seditious conspiracy. Even with the Oklahoma State Penitentiary crowded, with 450 suspects arrested following the Green Corn Rebellion, Carlos Weekly warned the incarcerated probably represented, quote, only a modicum of those involved in the seditious plans, unquote. In the days following the rebellion, state and local officials cast a wide net. All known radicals in the region, irrespective of the extent of their participation in the uprising, were considered to be suspects by local authorities and were subject to arrest. H.M. Sinclair, the state secretary of the Socialist Party of Oklahoma, realized that party members in the affected region would be among the most immediate suspects, and he quickly took steps to distance the organization from the rebellion. In a formal statement on the insurrection and the arrests that followed, Sinclair pointed out that while socialists were sympathetic with the farmers who participated in the insurrection, the Socialist Party believed in political action as a more effective way of promoting the interests of the working class. Lest there be any misunderstanding, Sinclair plainly asserted that the, quote, Socialist Party organization had nothing whatever to do, unquote, with the Green Corn Rebellion. Quote, we will continue the fight for working class emancipation along political lines, the statement concluded, and, quote, invite all those who are in sympathy with our platform to join with us and by intelligent action pave the way for a better day, unquote. By the way, there's a lot more I could read from this book. It's an excellent book for a lot of reasons. And that's where we're going to end this part of the story for this episode. By the way, in closing, we should mention that this week is the 100th anniversary of these events, but many folks across Oklahoma will be continuing this conversation for some time to come. Please join the conversation yourself by visiting the website for the Green Corn Rebellion Centennial, greencorn.org. Again, that is greencorn.org, greencorn.
Hello. welcome to A Wonder in Poetry with Serena Blaiz. This time I'm reading from a poem by Lauren Zuniga. It's from a book, The Smell of Good Mud. It's called Everything is Going to Be Amazing. Put on your knickers, girl. We gonna eat these heavy decisions for breakfast. Smother 'em in gravy, wash 'em down with grown-ass women's soda. We got this. This is the big girl processing plant. Don't nobody work through their issues like we do. We swallow abandonment and cough up independence. You want to scream? You see that freight train coming at you? You having that lead in your legs dream again? Kick that mother truck and train in its teeth and do a jig. That's what you need, some Mongolian throat-singing action and a can of river dance. Unwad your drawers, little mama. Let's go to the drag show. Bust out your corset, sweet ginger, and show 'em all that bullion. We were made for the stomp. We were made out of spoon-whittling voodoo stew. Play those spoons, girl. Don't let 'em take your dysfunction and turn it into a brothel. That's your dysfunction. You chop that shit up and make it into a masterpiece. This is the year of quit the dumb shit. So you know what that means? Quit the dumb shit. Stop washing your pearls down with swine. Get up off your Cadillac britches and show them motor-mouth badgers how it's done. Everything ain't gonna be all right. Everything is going to be amazing. Again, that was by Lauren Zuniga. She is an Oklahoma City-based spoken word artist, and she spent many years on the Poetry Slam circuit and did quite well for herself. You can find quite a few of her spoken word poems on YouTube. She, of course, does her own work much more justice than I do, but I think you get a little taste of what her voice is about. So her last name is spelled Zuniga, Lauren Zuniga. This has been Serena Blaiz with A Wonder in Poetry. Thank you for listening.
The webcast you just heard is a production of the Objector.Church. You can find out more about us at our website, Objector.Church.